name is Amit. I'm the founder of a company called Medici. We are probably one of the only or very few innovation and research platforms which is used by more than 30 banks and insurance companies globally. For this new industry called fintech, back in 2012-13, we started thinking about that it will require a new sort of a research and innovation platform to connect these startups and the corporates. So we are basically used by about 10,000 fintech startups, which we have on the platform, and on the other side, we have investors and banks. And this particular topic, of RPA and AI is something that we have been tracking since 2013. Before I go forward, let me just introduce you to the panel. So I would like to call upon Claire Calmejaine to the stage. She's Director of Innovation at Lloyds Bank. Welcome, Claire. Thank you. And I would also like to invite Micky Lo. He's the Director of Information and Risk Management at BNY Mellon, based out of Hong Kong. Welcome, Mike. Thanks for joining here. Before we go forward, I will just set the context a little bit. And because I expect that the people here in the audience are from financial services and fintech space, so we won't go into kind of the basics of it. But the topic we have been given is the keywords are artificial intelligence and robotic process automation. So in order to keep it sort of contained in the 30 minutes that we have been given, we are going to focus on how this whole journey of automation is happening, right? So started with manual work, and then went to computerization, and then went to automation, which is basically rules-based, which started getting called as robotic process automation. And then now we are talking about cognitive RPA or intelligent RPA, which is where we'll focus a lot today. And what does it take? How do you prepare the data, and how do you invest resources into big data analytics around that? And where we won't go today is that many other industries who are going through the same journey are also talking about autonomous stuff, right? So things like, which can run on their own. But we have seen within financial services space, it's not a reality. Just one particular fact on this is, a couple of examples on this rather is, so there is this AI-based hedge fund in US called Volion. They have been investing a couple of $1 billion every year using a completely autonomous AI-based hedge fund. And they released their results recently. Not a lot of them do actually, but they released the results and they said that it's not working out. And it's completely unsupervised machine learning based AI hedge fund. And similarly, a lot of people who started with autonomous robo-advisors are now shifting to something we call as robo-for-advisor. So that is a topic we will not be discussing today, the autonomous component of how far can we go. But I think we'll stick to, we have two very experienced bankers here who have been sort of looking at RPA and cognitive RPA. So we'll sort of, stick to those two topics. So, maybe we can start with a quick intro. Claire, maybe start with you. Introduction about yourself, the bank, and maybe a quick couple of lines on your thinking around this topic overall.
Sure. Sorry about the amount of data that is generated across the world is changing. And there is more and more need real time that is driven from the customer. So I think that's the why. There is the evolution of the technology, which is an important component. And you may have seen that Andrew Ng, who used to be the chief scientist of Baidu, and created like courses online at Stanford, which is one of the father of artificial intelligence, have just set up his own fund and raised 171 million. And these technologies are nascent. And so I think it's important to understand in the story how do they fit together. So I think automation as such is something that has been existing for some time, but I think automation is very limited when it's standalone. And this is why AI and ML is quite important when it comes on top. And the third point really is around the capability uplift, because let's be honest, this is a major capability of Lyft in financial services around, now, right now there is probably like 10 to 15 sub-roles that sit in the data category. And they are brand new, they've like completely emerged over the past 2 years. And that's something, I've worked quite a lot in Lloyds around building our digital capability and our academies. And how do we go about that? Because it's not as easy when you are a company that is 77,000 people to go in the street and just say, here is a bunch of startups or university, and here is the people I just want that are going to make it happen. And there is a bit like, how do you go through this journey that I think is worth chatting about today.
Thanks, Claire. Mickey, something about yourself and what is your thinking on this topic overall?
Sure, thank you. I look after information risk for BNY Mellon in the region. You may think it's rather strange, why would I be here talking about RPA and AI from a risk perspective? So I look at it from 2 angles. One is I work closely with my technology partners in terms of assessing all the risk associated with all the RPA and AI deployment within the business world. On the other hand, I also look inward into the risk department. How can we employ RPA and AI to make our risk management to be more effective and be able to use all the big data and able to make decisions in a faster manner. So when we look at RPA and AI, or RPA to be specific, in fact, it's really a journey. I remember when I worked on object orientation almost 15 years ago. It is very similar to RPA right now. How do we define all the method attribute? Is how do we define our APIs and so forth? And how do we evolve? I think earlier session someone mentioned about the regulators are supporting this journey, but on the other hand, we're also seeing regulation which may pull back in terms of data sharing. I mean, for example, GDPR in EU, which will have strong governance in terms of cross-border data transfer. How do we share data? So on the one hand, we push open banking. On the other hand, we enforcing cross-border data transfer restrictions. So it's interesting to see how this will be evolved over time. So in that perspective, when we look at internal AI or RPA from a RegTech perspective, which is perhaps a subcomponent of fintech, this is where we spend, or I personally spend a lot of time in that regard, and working with the business to look at all the RPA implementation in ensuring risk element and the privacy element are dealt with at the beginning of the RPA design. This is my major role.
Right. So, let's just start with a very simple example. That's how I sort of liked understanding this whole topic back in, like 3-4 years back, that in the accounts payable and accounts receivable department, there was a time when you will receive an invoice and you will take out the purchase order and manually match the PO number and the amount and everything, and then say, okay, it's good to go and good to pay. And then it went to, can you do optical image recognition, and then can you take the data and match it against the PO, and all of this happening, in a fairly automated, rules-based engine way, which is what RPA is. And now we are seeing companies and applications where, for an accounts receivable, the engine is deciding when to do the follow-ups and what should be the tone of the message. Should it be sort of, aggressive? Should it be kind of, calm? Because, it's just like 5 days since they have overshot the time. So depending on that, they're deciding the tone of the message as well. So it's going that far. That's a very basic example of how you understand this journey of automation, but we have 2 experts here. So, my question to you is that, are there any specific use cases that you would want to explain, both in the back office operations department, as well as anything on the front end that you are doing at your bank?
Yeah. So let me just take a little step back and I come back to your point. But I think, just to put things into context, I was talking about the why, and it's important to understand that in the past, in 16. We were measuring that 90% of the data in internet were produced over the past 2 years before 16. And I think I could not, I was watching the stats just before I came on stage, but I think in the month of January alone, we produced the same volumes than all the year of 16. So currently we produce 44 billion of gigabytes per day, and it's projected by 2025 that we produce around 450 gigabytes per day. So it's like, the dimension and the volume of this data is like super exponential, which drives a request for, like automation, but also the intelligence that go on top of it. I think one of the important points you mentioned where, how, as we go through using more this intelligence in the automation, how do you trust it? And, in this journey, I remember 7 years ago, I was at Harvard, and there was this competition between Harvard and MIT on the Jeopardy, with IBM Watson. And you could see that the statistic of the answer of like IBM Watson is like, even before people had pressed on the button, IBM Watson had already answered this question. So, machines and robots were already learning there. But that's a customer manifestation of it, and we tend to talk a lot about the customer manifestation, and we have like, Messenger. I don't know if you have used it, now M in your Messenger app from Facebook. But I think, this adoption from a customer perspective are yet to be proven. Like we know technology starts to be tangible, but I think it have yet to be adopted, proven. And I don't know how you feel about it, but personally, when Messenger tell me like, how do you want to organize this meeting? How does it connect? I do freak out a little bit. I'm quick to change, and I adapt quickly to technology. The counterpart of that is in operations, there have been technology like IBM Watson very solid and robust about making this decision and the optimization. So I was chatting with a company called Mondo Brain, who is based in Washington, and they've developed a full augmented intelligence that is used by several of the banks actually on credit decisioning or different area, and they generate a lot of savings because and this technology is actually used by nuclear center, so it's quite robust. So what we see is in operation, it's actually quite easy to implement it. So some of the use cases you will see in banks are probably less customer-facing, are more in operation and in back office, and they are not funky because of what I explained around the M and the messenger, which is like, well, there is still a little journey to go. So, what you will see is all, on credit decisioning, some of the applied, augmented intelligence that will start to arrive, some of the automations that go end-to-end, in some of the risk process, in some of the payment and transaction process will be there. What we have made some progress is on bots and web chat. So you had some early deployments that arrived that are operational. And just like, do a little test next time, but like we chat to a lot of bots on the internet. Next time you're chatting to a web chat, just ask them if they are robots. And you will be quite surprised. I do that all the time.
I guess I can perhaps share what I've seen in Hong Kong. I'm based in Hong Kong, by the way, covering APAC. There are many use of RPA or AI in the development of chatbots. So a lot of now a customer service desk or answering machines, they're actually RPA behind or robots behind. In some banks, I'm going to name banks, of course, including us as well. We have used RPA to implement something very fundamental, which is password reset engine. You can imagine in an organization with thousands of employees globally, every Monday morning we spend a lot of time in doing password reset. People tend to forget password after the weekend. So we implement a RPA process to recognize voice of the employees and able to, with certain questions, and be able to deduce if this is the right individuals who own the identity and then perform the password reset, as opposed to having a human being to answer the password request call. Another area that we're looking at is on our payment system. Being a global organization with different payment engine, with different jurisdictions in doing clearing, not to mention we have to clear with other counterparties and banks as well. So there's heavily manual in terms of sending payment file to a clearinghouse and so forth. So we're looking in terms of using RPA and AI to automate the payment systems, maybe directly with our counterparties instead of going through a intermediary. So that's one area we're exploring. Internally, we're using AI. My apology, I'm using the term AI and RPA interchangeably. I'm just seeing AI to be a constant RPA with a brain behind that. We're trying to look at how can we build our employee profile in terms of the behavior and use patterns. And with all those data that we collect, then we can predict any specific abnormal behaviors, which we can fit into our compliance process as well. Because right now, we have all this information. In order for us to determine if there is any specific anomaly that we should investigate, is very difficult when we have presence in 50+ countries worldwide with 50,000 employees. So we're looking into AI engine to be able to collect all those informations in terms of access log, system log, physical log, and so forth, and to perform analysis of a given role, what should be the behavior of that specific role. If we see any deviation from the behavior, that should trigger an alert, which then we can have a downstream investigation. So those are the things that we're exploring, among many other things as well.
So around these use cases, one of the things that I try to understand is that what is the kind of preparation that you need to be able to go towards cognitive RPA in this journey of automation. And I believe, as you were explaining, that data is exploding. What's the preparation you need to do from a big data analytics perspective, and what are the other things that need to be in place to even sort of looking at cognitive RPA? Are there some building blocks for this?
I mean, if you look at most of the RPA implementation, I actually believe you can start, like most of the time you can start in the data set you have. I think the question becomes, in the future, how does it work? Because, yes, there is 3 layers in this story. There is obviously the collection of the data which come from the outside. So there is, we have more and more medium now. I'm pretty sure some of you have Amazon Alexa or Google Home at home. So there is voice, there is videos, there is picture more and more with a growing number of picture and visualization that everybody has. So the complexity of the data is also exponential, and how do you capture that? So your point about, I want to identify my patterns, it's not anymore a set of characters that are sitting in a file, or they are, but in a different format, and you need to transcribe that into what does it mean. So you have this landscape that is expanding. Then we've chatted a little bit about infrastructure, and in the UK, obviously, we have the open banking infrastructure. So what does mean open data? And how do you compute, your internal data with your external data? Do you do ingestion, reaggregation? So, like all these questions about how do you architect, your middle layer are coming into play when you think about the future targets of your banking architecture. And the last part is the data itself, because there is structured data, unstructured data. There is just like a variety of things that currently are sitting in legacy systems that have been there for a long time. So how do you go about evolving to this new technology? But I think the big challenge in this story is, and we were chatting about, when I was talking about the fund of Andrew and G is, do you really bet to your Hadoop technology? Do you say, like, I go for a 3 to 4 years migration into, this type, or cloud, or, it's just fascinating. Last week I was with Michael Dell, and he was explaining their integration with EMC and where they are going, and like where supercomputing is going. Do you make these big data lakes that banks have? Do you bet it in a single technology? Do you bake it in several? And then you join by container? How do you go about that? How do you de-risk it? Because I will remember this story around now what it was 5 or 6 years ago. I was building a service stack online. So literally, like plugging technology was the early days of like online banking and internet banking. And one of the things that was very expensive is training our IVR technology, so our telephony banking technology, with a grammar for you to navigate it. And that's kind of stick around because we had to pay like for all this grammar to be trained and the system to be trained and etc. So when we started to talk about voice navigation on mobile, one of the points was like, okay, can we reuse this grammar we've prepared in telephony and can you put it in the mobile system? And they were like, oh no, it don't work like that, we have to retrain it and etc. So we said like, okay, fine, we'll wait a little bit and try to understand where you are in your journey as a provider that is going to merge this technology. And actually, about last year, so 7 months ago, we are sitting with the guys and say, what about the cost of this migration? They're like, oh, Claire, now with the amount of optimization we done on your system, this is free. All this cost, in millions that we paid before, this is free. So you just have to understand, when you talk about this, what is the journey you're going through, what are the type of bets you make in terms of investment, and how do you think they will pay back in return in order to enable you to do not just the RPA, but like the machine intelligence, automated intelligence, because these technologies are very nascent.
Looks like your job is becoming interesting every quarter, every year now. And the same question to you in terms of your preparation. What are the things that you have been sort of, because it looks like the way Claire explained that it's not just like the next quarter or the next year. In order to have stuff out there, you have to think about maybe 2 to 3 years. The problem is that the minute you start thinking 3 years ahead, and the industry changes so dynamically, how do you really prepare for this?
Right, it's easy to say, it's always think big and act small. So it's a long journey, but I agree totally that the first thing we need to do is really understand what is the ROI, the return on investment. And we need to get the business, well, from a bank perspective, we need to get the business to understand and support that, because at the end of the day, they have to see the benefit, and so that they will invest in this effort. What we trying to avoid is to put the cart in front of horses. So having to understand the business need and what can we do in order to make the business to be more efficient and effective and less expensive in terms of transaction cost. Those are the three fundamental pillars that we want to address. What we have been avoiding is not to flood the business with all those new technology, terminology, and so forth. Do not go to the business and say, hey, we have cloud, and we have blockchain, and we have Bitcoin. Can we use that? What we did is put aside all those technology, put aside all those other vendor partners that can help us and so forth, but try to understand the most painful challenge that the business is facing today, and how can we resolve those pain points for them using RPA or AI. So this is a fundamental project management 101, which always go back into the business requirement. And going back to the big data discussion, I'm sure most organizations, or in fact all organizations, have many data anyway. And a fundamental issue with the use of big data is people tend to look at all the data. Then we realize, oops, how can we rationalize all the data, and they're all different format, different shape and form and so forth, as Claire said earlier. But then most of the projects I've seen is what they miss is what are the fundamental questions that you want to ask derived from those data. I will have many data from include business logs and technology logs and user logs and customer logs and so forth. But how do I make use of that? What fundamental business questions I want to ask? Then I can examine those data, whether I can provide those information. Now, most organizations, including us as well, we're shifting our organization. Well, not shifting, but we're also creating new role. I'm sure many of you have come across the new role called data scientist or chief data officer. So the fundamental role is not really a technologist role, but it's more to understand the business data and how can we make use of that, and what should we collect, and how can we collect, and what is the jurisdiction requirement in terms of retention and disposal of data, and before we can really move into the next step. So those are the basic that we need to get moving. Now, implementation-wise, it has to be a small step. The business want to see benefit. They want to see immediate benefit before they can further continue to fund the project. Despite we have a 3-year, 5 years journey, we started the journey on Open API almost 3 years ago. It is still a journey. We're not there yet, right? So we're evolving with many APIs, and we're experimenting with our clients. How can they connect through those Open API into us and so forth? And based on that 3 years experience we have had, we keep on evolve our API set. Are we ready? Are we there yet? No, it's a journey. The destination keep on moving. So what we need to do is our architecture and strategy has to be flexible and adaptive to accept any environmental change that may affect the journey in that sense. So I guess no one will think of those AI be mature that fast a decade ago. But now AI is almost behind us. So what's next? And there's some things we need to look forward as well.
So one thing I want to share, because both of these panelists are very modest, that in case you don't know, BNY Mellon in the US is known for one of the first banks there to actually start thinking about open APIs and sort of offering it to the outside world, as well as a lot of internal work that they have done. And it's a case study for a lot of other banks there. And similarly, on 13 January, when CMA deadline for open banking in UK sort of kicked off. One of the banks which was actually ready amongst the top 9 banks was actually Lloyds Bank. And what I see as common is that the work that both these banks have done in the area of RPA and cognitive RPA, and again the long-term thinking goes back to the fact that they are also thinking about open APIs. So a lot of these things are actually interconnected, and you can't really do it in a piecemeal approach, is what I understand. But let me quickly change the topic and discuss a little bit about from a fintech perspective, right? So we actually work with a lot of fintech startups to bring them to the banks, as you know, and one of the questions that keep asking is that, so for example, let's take the area of chatbots. Pretty much all the chatbots which are currently out there in the banking domain may not be sort of, something that, you can be proud of, because they just don't work in the way that you would want it to be. They are absolutely, if they have to cross a threshold, they have to be better than, the customer service being provided by the human beings, which is not currently. So a lot of these platforms which enable, like, the fintech startups which have been building chatbot as a white label solution for banks, they ask us that, so the problem is that we have to build the product, and then when we go to the banks, they also ask us that, have you taken care of risk and compliance? As Mickey, you were talking about that, you spend a lot of time on that, but it has major repercussions at a banking institution. And again, the other thing is context, right? You can't build a great chatbot for banking unless you understand the core banking solution and the protocols and the context of what kind of questions are asked and how does the backend systems work, and have those open APIs and all of that as well. So how much of this, my question to you guys is that if fintechs approach you, how much of that you expect from them? Do you just expect that they come up with a great technology product or the app, and then because you guys already are sort of experts in the area of risk and compliance, and you can bring the context, so the rest of it can be taken care of by you, or you expect them to sort of cover all these 3 things, tech, context, as well as risk compliance, and then come to you?
So I love you asking the question, because I think I was listening to Mickey, and I just wanted to put the massive caveat that I think the journey Mickey and I are talking about is the journey of large organization and how do they transition, because we have to deal with the legacy, and the size of our data lakes is already there, and the nature of the data is not like the data that exists today in the internet. It's the data sometimes that has been stored for a long time. And obviously, I was quite amazed today and even yesterday by some of the startups, like Anthony this morning was saying, like, his cost-income ratio is 25%. When you run his operation, like, you can figure out that there is quite a lot of integration here. Lloyds don't stand badly with 46%, but it's like, a difference. Or Megan was talking about the fact that, I think she was mentioning, I don't know if I get it right, but Monzo running in a 2 million, for their ops budget per year is like super efficient. So I think, startups have really superb technologies they bring on the table. I think sometimes just have to be a bit realistic about what is a ticket to entry. So I think, for a bank, building a chatbot is really not complicated. So, it's like, I remember when my developer built the chatbot in Facebook Messenger when the API was open, it took him like 15 minutes, and it was working, on our test environment. We actually went to some of our supplier and fixed it so it can work in the mobile, app with something that was not Facebook Messenger. So the cost about making that a chatbot work is actually not a barrier for a bank to realize it. It will just be a matter of prioritization. So it will just be like in the big scheme of things that we have to finish between the long tail servicing and the sales process, like, where does this fit, and what is the customer adoption about it. I think some other startups, and I'm going to mention here one like Personetics, which have worked quite a lot in their product, and how advanced it is in order to really push the nudging, which is a very specific technique. So Moven, like, they really work in this specific capability. This is where they really add something, okay, maybe we didn't have the time to really think and work about that. I think that's the best example of when you can work with an organization. Find the spot where it's super relevant, there is an economical driver, and it's an untapped area for us. If you just come with a capability which is a chatbot, I think 100% of the time we'll say we love it, but we don't have any issue about doing that. We are building, we are processing 2.3 billion of change. We've been merging all our group transformation together with change business and IT, all integrated end-to-end. We have monthly release. In mobile, we release like in a fortnight. It's super efficient. I mean, it's efficient in the banking world.
And that's why there are these hundreds of these white label chatbot platforms, but then there are 3 or 4 of them which are basically, I have talked to at least 30 banks who are using, any of these platforms, and it's usually those 3-4 names. And I think it goes on to say that those are the parameters. But Micky, from your perspective, what's your take on this?
As I said before, it seems as fintech is a journey. I don't expect any fintech vendor will be able to come in to answer all the 3 questions that you stated: technology, context, and risk and compliance. We look towards the fintech vendors to have these innovative thinkings in terms of how we can, financial institutions can do better with their concept or their technology, and then will certainly help. I think it's a two-way street that will help with the context, will help with the risk and compliance and so forth. Now, but of course, we will expect the fintech vendors should understand the basic fundamental requirement from regulators. As bank, we're subject to all the different jurisdictions in terms of countries of footprint. So the challenge with all those different, I spent a lot of time looking at KYC and AML, RegTech or fintech, right? There are so many vendors doing KYC and AML. They are all different, they're all the same, kind of. But then the point is, okay, are we meeting which jurisdictions in terms of regulatory requirement in that space? Most vendors were not able to answer the questions. They have not really, assessed their product against those countries they want to do business in terms of the regulatory requirement. So I view that there's homework that vendors should do and be able to at least to help organizations who adopt those technology to understand, okay, you have already met the baseline requirement of certain regulators, so we can then continue discussions with other things that we want to add on to that and so forth. And that's how we want to approach. The other challenge in working with the fintech working on the fintech environment is how do we share knowledge with the vendors, right? Those knowledge could be proprietary to any organizations. Do we provide the knowledge to the fintech vendor hosting environment, or do we have this specific fintech component to be operating in our data centers so that we don't really have to send knowledge externally in specific to all the cross-border transfer restrictions? So those are the areas still, I don't have an answer, but we can work together definitely with fintech partners.
Right, and I can see that the time is up. Thanks, Claire and Micky, for sharing all the great insights. Appreciate that. This is a fairly nuanced topic. There are a lot of other aspects. We are all learning, I guess. So if you want to catch us offline and discuss some other aspect, we'll be available. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.